Hello, this is Mick Holly, and welcome to this webinar. We've got a short amount of time together today, probably sort of 45, 50 minutes, perhaps leave some time for questions. And the topic for our webinar is the art of negotiation. Now, there obviously is a lot of science and discipline behind negotiation. We're not going to cover that aspect of it because we would never be able to fit it into a 45-minute webinar. We're going to be talking about the art, so some of the tips and some of the tricks that you can use to be more effective negotiators, and hopefully you'll be able to take some of those tips and use them, practice them, and with a little bit of practice they'll become habits and they will serve you well in all your future negotiations. So that's the goal of our time here together. Let's get started. This first slide is really about why is negotiation important. I've got a couple of slides here. This one is, very common negotiation. The sales team is out there trying to win some business, and the prospector said, yeah, we'll give you the business, but we're looking for a little bit of a discount. And this table at the top here really shows that as your gross margin comes down, the impact of discounting is more significant. So if we take this line at the bottom, what it says, if you discount by 10% when your margin is 50%, you've got to sell 25% more work to recover that gross margin. Similarly, if you are selling at a 20% gross margin, then you give a 10% discount, you would have to sell, as much again to recover that. And this really shows it. So at full price, the salesperson has gone out and said, our price is $100,000 for these products or services, and our cost of goods sold is $80,000. So we make $20,000 of gross profit on that deal. But here we see that we've given a discount. So our revenues drop by 10% to $90,000. Our cost of goods remains the same. And so ultimately our profit is $10,000. So you see that it's half of what it was. So in order for us to get that gross profit back, we'd have to double the amount of sales. So even a tiny amount of discounting can actually have a very significant impact on your business. So you want to be able to negotiate effectively when you have those discussions. Here's a second one for all of you who've got children, and the children are going to go to college or in college and perhaps looking at their first job. Here's a little study that looked at negotiation as part of negotiating a starting salary, and this study looked at MBAs, and the starting salary of an MBA is about $100,000 per annum. Well, we'd all wished we'd started on that when we left college, right? But anyway, that's the current rate. Interestingly, most men will ask for more money. Women tend not to do so, but on average, they get an extra 7%. So instead of $100,000, they'll negotiate up to $107,000. Now let's look at the consequence of that decision. If we actually take that $7,000 and invest it in the stock market, let's assume a modest appreciation of 5% per annum, and we work for 30 years, that 7,000 accumulates over that time to give us a whopping $500,000 nest egg. So that first negotiation in terms of your starting salary is pretty important. So we can see that negotiation is a necessary and skill, and it pays for itself. So let's just take a moment. What do we mean by negotiation? Well, it's not so much of a discussion, but a back and forth, a to and fro communication designed to reach an agreement. But parties have some shared interests and some interests that are in opposition. And the art of negotiation is to find out what those shared understandings are, and really to resolve some of those oppositions and get to a place of agreement. And if we do our job well, a good negotiation we'll reach, a sensible agreement, something that we're happy with, something that makes sense in terms of good business. It's efficient. It didn't take too long. And in that whole process, that whole discourse, we didn't damage the relationship. And if we've done it really well, then ultimately it might even improve that relationship. So how do we go about doing this? It sounds relatively straightforward, but of course we know that negotiations are rather challenging at times. Well, first thing is, one of the points I wanted to really emphasize today was that 93% of our communication is non-verbal. So only 7% of our communication, the words we use, represents that communication. The other channels of communication are how we sound and how we look. And we spend a lot of time thinking about the words that we're going to use, our negotiating position, the bullet points that we want to make. We even create fancy charts to put them on. And we don't necessarily give as much thought, if any, to how we sound, how we look, and how we prepare to sound better, to look better, and to communicate. And the important thing is our communication must be congruent. So we can say some words, but if we don't really believe them, then our negotiation party is not going to believe what was our sincerity either. So let's just break that down a little bit in terms of how we sound. So the volume of our voice, the louder we are, the more confident perhaps we sound. The pitch, the higher or lower pitch does make a difference, and whether our voice is resonant, and we can improve the sound, the quality, the resonance of our voice by making sure that we're breathing properly and that we have a posture that allows our voice to resonate from top to bottom. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Rate of speech. If I slow down to emphasize some points, it draws the audience in. If I speak very, very quickly, sometimes it's difficult for our audience to understand what we're saying, and there is a power in the pause. So when we're in negotiations, we tend to get very excited and we want to get all of our points out, but actually pausing at some points for emphasis really does have a difference. And of course, variation in your voice, so you're not monotone the whole time, brings that conversation to life and creates that level of excitement and interest. And the way that you inflect your voice. So if you have an upward inflection, it almost sounds as though we are questioning, we're open. Whereas when we say something with a downward inflection, I'm saying something that has a sense of more finality and confidence to it. So the way that we use these techniques really changes the meaning and the emphasis of our dialogue. And then how we look. So if you're going into a negotiation, perhaps it's off-site, it's not part of your company, you want to think about how you dress. And a good rule of thumb for this is that it's okay to dress one level up. So if they're casual, then wearing some kind of a jacket is okay, but wearing a suit would be too much. So it's okay to dress a little bit better or the same as your audience. And then how you stand will affect how you look. If you stand confidently, you have an assertive posture, then you're conveying conviction and confidence. Too much hand movement can be a little bit confusing. And then head position, holding your head up and your shoulders back, gives a much more authoritative posture. And the other thing is, people looking at your eyes, and have an amusing little video here for you. It's a comedian from Northern Ireland. His name is Michael McIntyre, and it really illustrates the point that your eyes, and in this particular instance, your eyebrows, can convey a lot of meaning. So let's have a look at this video.
Most of the things I'll be talking about tonight will involve having my eyebrows up. It's not to say that I don't put them down from time to time, but most of the time, they're up. Yeah, probably shouldn't have mentioned it at the start, because what happens is people just end up looking at your eyebrows and you don't really listen to what you're saying. Just watching these two little bits of fur move up and down. But it is important to know where your eyebrows are when you're talking. Always have your eyebrows up when you're asking someone where the toilets are. Do you know where the toilets are? Toilets? Don't be going, do you know where the toilets are? Toilets. Or, is that your daughter? Is it? Is that your daughter? Do you know where the toilets are?
All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed that little episode. But there you can see the how our eye movement and our body language really does create a different sense in that session. So here's an interesting study that was done by Nalini Ambady, a social psychologist. What she did was to film teaching professors, and she filmed them and then distilled that video clip down to a silent 2-second video clip and showed it to some students and asked the students how well they thought that professor would teach the subject. And you can see here there's two examples. You can even start to sense this. Which of these two do you think would be a better communicator? This professor on the left or Bill Nye, the science guy, on the right? He seems much more engaging, doesn't he? So we're already making some judgments. But what Nalini did was then randomize these students, and they then spent a semester with the representative professors, and she asked them at the end of the semester to rate their ability to teach and to communicate. And there was an absolute correlation between the silent 2-second video clip and an entire semester. So we as human beings have this innate and powerful capability to be able to look at somebody's non-verbal communication and in the space of just a few heartbeats determine whether they're going to be an effective communicator. And so we do this in negotiations. The first few seconds, you're already setting expectations, you're already communicating yourself well ahead of time. So how do we prepare for this? How do we get ready? Well, look at this slide here. Which of these two people do you think would be a more effective negotiator? The lady on the left, this is just a stock photo, or the lady on the right, which is Mary Barra, the CEO of General Motors. I would think that you would think that Mary is much more imperious, much more authoritative, much more powerful. And if those two people were in a negotiation, you think you would give more credence and authority to the lady on the right, just because of her posture and her executive presence. In fact, I actually teach a course. I get a lot of executives and teach them what I call executive presence, where we take these communication and presentation skills, and it really is a lot of fun. Do a lot of video work, do a lot of role playing. But interestingly, what this study in Forbes said in a survey of 268 executives, they asked what were the important things for getting promoted in business. And 26% said executive presence, that aura of confidence, that aura of authority really makes a big difference in their business trajectory, in their business success. And similarly, this has the same kind of impact in our negotiations. So we need to make sure that aura is built, that aura is developed, that you optimize how you look and how you present yourself to the negotiating party. So let's take a moment now and think about, knowing some of those things, what are some of the tricks, what are some of the tips that we can utilize before we get into the negotiation? This is all about how do we create the mindset, how do we prepare ourselves for success, critically important. The first thing is knowing your audience, knowing the other party. And the best way I've found of trying to explain this is think about it as if you were going to write a love letter to somebody, you wouldn't if you're going to write a love letter to somebody, you wouldn't write it to whom it may concern. In order for it to be meaningful, you need to be intimate with that person, and it needs to be very, very focused, and it requires you to understand them at a deep level. So when we're thinking about going into a negotiation, we want to be thinking about the other party. What are their interests? They will have set out some interests, some wants, if you will, but behind that are all those human emotions. And in the negotiating paper that hopefully you downloaded, I talk a little bit more about those emotional needs, those political needs. So, getting this deal might be important, but making sure that it's not risky would be important to their business career, to their business survival. So they might not say that in the negotiation, that's important, and you'll be focusing on the content of the negotiation. But if you can get to that level and you can start to communicate how you're going to manage this relationship, how you're going to mitigate their risk, then you're attending to that deeper emotional need for survival, for business survival, that will help you with success. So think about your audience. How much do they know about the subject? What do you think that they can what are the benefits, but also what would be the consequences of not getting this deal? And in the paper, I talk about that loss aversion. So think about what would they get out of the deal, and then what would they lose out of the deal, and try and bring that comprehension and understanding into the conversation. But the more that you can understand your audience before that you go in, the more successful that you will be. The second thing, again, really getting our mind into the right frame, is visualization. All great athletes and high achievers visualize success ahead of time. And so in this particular example, there was a study at the University of Chicago where they tested athletes to be able to make free throws in basketball. So they got a chance to make 100 attempts, and their performance was rated. And then that group was broken into 3 separate subgroups. Group number 1 were asked to practice 1 hour a day making free throws. The second group were asked not to practice at all. And the third group were asked just to imagine making 100 free throws. So then they were brought back together and they were tested. And interestingly, group 1, who had practiced 100 free throws every day, actually improved by about 24%. Not a surprise. Practice helped us improve. The second group, who didn't practice, had no improvement, which is what you would expect. But here's the startling point. The third group, who only imagined making baskets, improved by 23%, almost identical to the group that physically practiced. How startling is that? So the point is, if you're when you think about your negotiation, think about the outcomes, think about the success, and role play it in your head. You could even role play it with members of your own team so that you become familiar. And what this does is it creates a program in your head so that when you actually go into the negotiation, it's just really, you're just triggering a replay. The important thing about this is it frees your mind. You're not thinking now about every single step because you've already done it, you've already practiced it. Now what it lets you do is it allows you to turn on your antenna and to listen for those inflections in the party, for that inner meaning, for where their concerns are. And it really allows you to be attentive to their needs, because we want to be able to listen to understand, not listen to make our points. If I'm just thinking in my head, I've got to do this, I've got to mention this, I've got to put this point across, I've got to put that point across, you are not listening to the other party. And if you can just turn that noise off in your head and listen to them, then you're going to be much more effective. And the other party is going to recognize that you are genuinely interested and sincere about what it is that their concerns and their points. It will hugely change the success in your negotiations. So visualize ahead of time. Now you may think that your first impression is created, when you shake hands and you go into that negotiation. But your first impression, your digital signature is going ahead of you. I know whenever I meet a new executive, I always go onto LinkedIn and see, what kind of person. I want to see a picture of their face. I want to try and get some impressions. I want to see where they went to school. I want to see what kind of interests there are. This is all about, knowing your audience, writing that love letter. I try and garner as much information as possible. So LinkedIn is a very powerful tool in business. And here's a quick clip from my LinkedIn page. And I'm going to give you a few tips on how to maximize your first impression, because this might be something that they will look at. So first of all, you can see there, I've got a professional headshot. It's not my Facebook picture. It's not my Instagram picture. It's a business professional picture. I'm trying to convey a level of seriousness. Now, you may not choose to have a tie or not, but I think, looking professional is important. I deal a lot with owners of businesses, with executives in business. So, I want to convey a level of professionalism. That's why I have a tie and a jacket on in this particular example. But you need to pick what's important for you, but have it done professionally, and your company will probably pay for that investment. They certainly should. And secondly, instead of having your title in the slide, talk about what you can accomplish, what you can do for people. So you can see, I help executives drive improvements that move the dial in the financial statements. I'm conveying that, I'm delivering financial results. And then I actually have a call to action. Click below to see how. And then beneath this, and I've not put that in, are a series of articles and documents and videos which allows people to see how I can do that for them. So it's a great way of parading your skills. The third thing is you can make your web address look more personalized. So on LinkedIn, it'll have a series of numbers. You can actually put your name in the headline, which makes it easier to search for. And then you see here on all LinkedIn profiles, it'll tell you how many people you are connected with. Now, why is that important? Well, if I've only got 3 connections, it might indicate that I'm not quite the social butterfly. But more importantly, it says I'm not really connected. Whereas if I see somebody with 500 connections, think that person is really connected, and if those connections are in your industry, that person is an authority. So it conveys authority. And when I say here, get at least 500 contacts, LinkedIn just says once you get to 500, it goes to 500 plus. You might have 501, and you'd be surprised at how relatively easy it is to collect at least 500 contacts. So now we're conveying some authority. I'm saying that I'm connected with a lot of people. And I mentioned before, get that call to action in your headline. So that LinkedIn profile is your front person. That is your first impression traveling ahead of you. So that should say the same kind of things as when you enter that negotiation. I'm somebody of confidence. I'm well connected. I'm an authority. I'm a serious player. You've already stacked the deck in your favor before you even get into the negotiation. So what else can we do before we actually get into this? So we've talked about that visualization and the power of the mind, but the mind can actually affect how you stand. So if you are really confident and you believe in something, you actually represent that in your words, your actions, your habits, and your values. And as Gandhi says here, this ultimately becomes your destiny. But here's the corollary of that, the reverse of that, is that your posture, the way that you stand, can actually change the way that you feel. Now, this is really interesting. So here's a set of pictures. On the top row, we've got people sitting and standing in what's called a high power pose, right? Just confident, upright, open. Whereas the poses in the bottom are a little bit more supplicant, low power, quiet, introverted, and it even looks less confident. And here's what's fascinating. This lady here, Amy Cuddy at Harvard University, did a study where she asked people to practice a high power pose or a low power pose, and then she put them through a job interview with a 3-person panel. And then the interviewers had to rate who they would give the job to. And here's the fascinating thing. All the people that took the high power pose got the job. Those with the low power pose didn't get the job. And this was a completely randomized group. All they were asked to do was to adopt this pose for 2 minutes before they went into the interview. So think about that when you go into a negotiation. Practice this posture, because what she did, she then analyzed their body chemistry after a posing for 2 minutes. And what she found was that a 2-minute pose, a high power pose, raises testosterone levels by 20%. So that raises the level of confidence one has. And concurrently, it reduced their stress hormone by 25%. So now you've got your confidence rising and your stress lowering. How much more effective do you think you're going to be as a negotiator? You're calm and you're confident. Now, the people that adopt the low power pose, the opposite happened. So their confidence levels dropped and their stress levels went up. So they're going into the negotiation, feeling tight, stressed, worried, scared, which body chemistry you think is going to influence you to have the best negotiation? And think about this. When you're sitting outside of a negotiation, you're sitting outside of a meeting room, you might be hunched over your notes, you're reading all of your points that you're going to make because you didn't really visualize, you didn't really practice, so you're really, you're cramming at the last minute to get all that data, but you're automatically sitting in that low power pose, and you're changing your body chemistry, you're changing your confidence, and you're changing your ability to have the most successful outcome. So really, really practice this. Now, I'm not saying that you stand like Wonder Woman or Superman in the lobby, but, why not walk around? You can read your notes standing up. You could walk around, and that gets the blood flowing. That gets you in the right power pose. And then when you walk into that meeting, you've got high energy. You've got low stress, and you've got that charisma. That aura is just so much more powerful. And I talk about in the paper how you can even influence that further by what I call going naked into the meeting. So I would encourage you to look at that. We don't have time to cover that in this webcast. All right, so that was what we did all that before we even walked into the negotiation. So there's a lot you can do. That's all art. That's all practice. These are simple tips that will have a huge impact. Now let's look at some of the techniques that we might use in the negotiation itself. If there's just one thing that you could do, and that is to breathe. We tend to get very, very shallow breathing. You see over here, here's how our lungs work. Right down here at the bottom, because of gravity, the blood tends to accumulate down here. So when the air gets down into the lungs down here, the blood is flowing at a quart a minute down here. Whereas at this high level, it's only flowing at a tablespoon per minute because there's not much blood up this end. But where do we tend to breathe when we're tense, when we're in a meeting, when we're giving a presentation? Right up here at the top. So you're just not getting enough oxygen in your body, and that means you get a little bit more tight, a little bit more tense. So really, before you walk into that meeting, and this will help. You remember we were doing the power pose and we're walking around in the lobby, or we're standing outside that meeting. As we're walking, we can inhale, exhale, and really oxygenate. And then what I do in the meeting is I'll have little notes in the margin of my booklet to say breathe. I need to remind myself to breathe because sometimes we get so tense that we forget. And also the other impact of very shallow breathing is it makes our voice sound a little squeaky. The pitch rises, and that makes you sound less confident and less believable. So really practice and think about breathing. And this isn't just in negotiation. I see this a lot when I teach people in that executive presence course to give presentations. A lot of people really don't breathe during that presentation, and as that goes on and on, they get faster and faster and more out of breath. And so having that discipline, it needs to be practiced, it needs to be controlled in order to be effective. So it might sound simple, but it is quite profound in its effect. All right, so here's one of my hobby horses, if you will, and that is, the format in which you're going to convey your ideas to the other party. So there's different ways of doing it. In a very complex negotiation, you might have, contracts and detail and backup data and lots of reports. So, you'll have a report format, and we might even be poring over it line by line and going through all of that rational understanding. Sometimes you're trying to convey meaning. You're trying to explain how your idea, how your proposal is going to help them, and that meaning unfolds as the presentation goes forward. And you may be using some, PowerPoint or keynote slides to help you do that. And then the last way of doing it is a much more theatrical. The story. You have an arc. You have a journey that you're going to take your fellow negotiator through to really reveal a lot more detail and a lot more emotional impact. And I think that's the more that you can veer to the right of this diagram, the more that you can get story and conversation and dialogue, the more meaning and the more effective your negotiation is going to be. And this is one of the reasons why studies have shown that we can only carry in our heads 7 complex ideas. So if you're going into a negotiation, you've probably got 7 points that you want to make, and you've got a lot of rationale behind those points. So your brain is talking to yourself about all of those 7 concepts. Now, the person that you're negotiating with, they've got their concepts in their head, and their heads are resonating, talking about their concepts. So how is it possible then, with all of these voices in your head, for you to even hear what the other party is trying to convey? And so you have 2 people who are almost schizophrenic. They're just talking to themselves, and that's why negotiations sometimes really don't go very well, because you're only listening to your ideas and you're listening to make your point. So you've got your 7 ideas, and one of your ideas is let's say you need to convey a price, and you're waiting for the other person to say price. And you're not hearing what the other person's saying about price. It's just a trigger for you to let your concept out and get it onto the table. So you're not listening to understand, and the other party senses that you're not listening. I had a great mentor, Jerry Burke, in my early career, and he told me once, Mick, he said, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and you need to use them in that proportion. And you remember when we talked earlier about replaying and visualizing the meeting. Once you've got that replay in your mind going, it allows you to let the noise in your head quieten down around those 7 concepts, those points that you need to get out, and listen to the other party. So it's going to make you a more effective listener. One of the critical skills in negotiation is listening to the other party, to try and understand, their needs, and to read between the lines. And the other thing is that as human beings, we're wired. We've always conveyed complex ideas through the power of story. I mean, think about when you were a kid, how you used to love having stories read to you, and those fables, those morals, those concepts of good versus evil, of love, hate, all of those concepts were conveyed through story. So let's just look at the power of story. If we're just relaying facts in our negotiation, bullet point, bullet point, bullet point, here's a fact. The Queen died, the King died. Okay. Now, if we convert that into a story, we can tell that story as quickly as we relayed that fact, but with much more power. The Queen died. The King died of a broken heart. Wow. Now, that got you emotionally, didn't it? That gets what do you think you're going to remember? Would you remember a series of facts, or would you remember an emotional story? And would you understand the complexity of the kingdom there, and all of the issues associated, with the monarchs dying, is much richer in the story side than on the fact side. So when you're preparing for your negotiation, try and not have too many, presentations, bullet points, slides, and really ask yourself, what is the essence? What is the story that I want to enroll the other side? And also, what is their story? Where is their emotion? Where is their politics? Really try and get, into, that kind of appreciation. All right. Here's something that I promised on the webinar, which is the Jedi mind tricks of FBI hostage negotiation. So I recently read this book. It's called Never Split the Difference, Negotiating as if Your Life Depended on It by Chris Voss. And he was, I would recommend that you read this book. It has some excellent points in it, and it'll probably make the points better than I can today. But I just want to give you a little taste of that. And in hostage negotiations, splitting the difference, it just isn't going to work. If they say $100,000 or your child dies, and you negotiate down to 50,000, and the child has lost, you only get it with, 2 legs. Really, the difference, splitting the difference, isn't a successful outcome. And there are many, many good tips. And I've pulled one here that he calls out. He calls, this is as close to a Jedi mind trick as you could possibly get. And think about this. He might be negotiating behind a locked door or on a telephone, and everything is very, very tense, and he's really trying to understand the other party, trying to calm them down, trying to really understand what can be done, what can be accomplished. And so there's just some very, very simple steps. And the first step one is really to use a very calm voice that is, is questioning. Remember, we use that upward inflection when we're asking that questioning voice, and that I'm open, I'm interested in what you have to say. And the first thing that he always does is, he asks, what do you want? I'm sorry, I don't understand. How can I help you? Very open, upward inflection, and then he goes quiet, and he's waiting for the other party to state their intention, and they might say something quite aggressively to begin with, and then he mirrors that. Now, this isn't mirroring in a body language sense. The word I would probably use would be parroting, because what he wants is for you to take the last 3 words, most 3 words of that response, and repeat it in a question. Just repeat it. You don't need to embellish it. You don't need to embroider it. You just repeat those 3 words, and then pause. And during that silence, the other party will then say something else. They will add a little bit to what they just said, and you would then repeat that whole process. So, okay, so you said this, what do you mean by that? And they then answer, and then you mirror those last 3 words, and you pause. And often they'll just keep on talking, and they'll say some things, and you pick out the last 3 things. And as you do that iteratively, it builds a level of empathy that is incredibly powerful and helps you navigate. So when on the other side, the people are getting a little testy, just ask a question, and when they put their response, repeat what they said, and then pause. And they will fill in the blanks for you, and they will tell you more information. And this isn't rocket science. This is very, very simple, something that you can practice, with other people on your team, and it's incredibly powerful. And I would recommend, getting that book. And I talk a little bit more about that in the paper that I let you have. The other important thing is really try not to take positions, because positions lead to an impasse. Really try and understand what are their interests, what are their aims, what are their goals, not what do they stand for. Let me try and bring that to life for you by the way of an analogy. So there are two gentlemen sitting in the public library, and they're having an argument about the window. One of them wants the window open, and one of them wants to have it closed, and they cannot reconcile this, and they get into a position. One says, my position is it needs to be closed, and the other position is I need it to be open. There's just nowhere to go from there. They're at loggerheads and they're arguing. And the librarian comes over. She's heard there's a bit of a ruckus, and she doesn't really like a lot of noise in her library, so she comes over and she says, what appears to be the problem? Well, I want the window open. And the other one said, I need it closed. And so she said, well, she turns to the person who wants the window open and says, why do you want the window open? He said, well, it's very stuffy in here and I would like some fresh air. Then she turns to the person who's really wanted the window closed. Why do you want the window closed? He said, well, because when it's open, I get cold air on my neck and it affects my arthritis, and I don't want that to happen. So the librarian walks into the next room and opens the window, allowing fresh air to circulate into that area of the library, but the other gentleman with the arthritis doesn't experience a draft. So by getting away from a position, from a stance, and really trying to understand what's our aim, what are our goals, what are we really trying to do? So you really need to go beneath the positions and really try and understand what their interests are. So good questions around why do you want that? Why is it important? Just keep asking the why and really trying to understand. And remember, when we ask the question, we then pause. We wait for the other person to answer, and then we repeat that, and we'll get that understanding. We'll get that layering, and really get to a position of, I can see a way that we can have, a shared outcome without having impossible and impassable positions. So another technique that you can use to not get into that positional posturing is to structure your interests or concerns in your context and not theirs. So for example, you could say, I feel let down, as opposed to you broke your word. So you think the other party's not lived up to their party. If you go and attack them and say, you broke your word, you said something else, they can interpret that as an attack. They can disagree with you. They can find it quite offensive, and their hackles will go up, whereas they can't argue with your feelings. If you feel let down, then you feel let down. It's a much more disarming way, and you're bringing the emphasis on them and you're not attacking them. Similarly, we feel discriminated against is less antagonistic than saying you're a racist. Or you could always say, when the other party has come up with something and you believe they said something quite the contrary in the lead up to the negotiations or even earlier in the process, you could say, that's not what you said, and that's really not going to be that productive. Whereas if you said, I may have misunderstood what you said, not taking a position, really probing for interest. Very simple, but very, very powerful, and will avoid you getting to that log jam in your negotiation. I'd let you take a moment to look at this slide here on anchoring. So anchoring is a process of, in negotiation, of putting a number out there to anchor what you think the value is on your side of the equation. They did a study with real estate agents, and they listed a house, and they for some of the real estate agents, they listed it at a high level, and for others, they listed it at a lower level, and then asked them to value the house. And where the initial listing was higher, they would tend to put their estimate of the value of the house a little bit higher. So one way that you can anchor in your negotiations is to sort of indicate what your upper range might be, and that will start to set the boundaries for the conversation. Quite a powerful technique. So I think we're about running out of time. So let's see what I've got left. Oh yes, sometimes you don't get a deal. Sometimes it's best to, a bad deal is better than. Sorry, no deal is better than a bad deal. And so best alternative to a negotiated agreement, before you go into a negotiation, understand what your bottom line is that you won't go, below. And if you get to that point, you just have to get up and say, all right, we're just not going to agree today. The other thing that you can build in is a tripwire. This might be something that you could put in terms of concessions or discounts, and you might agree with your manager, your boss, your functional leader that, if you get to that point, we could go a little bit lower, but it's going to trigger, it's a tripwire to say, hey, I don't have the authority to make that decision. Let's recess while I go and check with my department, or let's see if we can do that. And that gives a nice little pause in the negotiation and allows you not to make significant mistakes and concessions in the heat of the moment. All right. Well, I hope you've enjoyed what we've chatted about today. Here's some summary of that. Non-verbal communication is incredibly important, as is your first impression, and being able to control those, being able to work on those before you go into the meeting in terms of mindset and posture is very, very important. Know your audience, know their interests before you go in. Practice that power pose so you change your body chemistry to becoming calm and confident. Breathe while you're in there. Use stories to narrate your side of the negotiation. Listen to understand, not to be understood, and discuss interests, not positions. And then the FBI method: use a calm voice, ask a question, repeat what they said, pause, and then repeat the whole process. Incredibly powerful. And the techniques of anchoring and best alternative to a negotiated agreement. Well, I hope you got, if you just got, one or two tips that you could practice that are very, very simple. I think the power pose is incredibly powerful as a technique that will forever change, how successful you are as a negotiator. So this is my telephone number. If you have any upcoming negotiations, if you have concerns about presentations or communication, I'm always keen to hear about your stories and how we might help you. And I think maybe we've got a few minutes for questions.